Good evening and welcome to the launch of this amazing book that is going to change the world, The White Pharaoh. I'm Geeta Pradhan, President of the Cambridge Community Foundation, and it was an absolute pleasure and an honor when Omo asked me if I would introduce him this evening. As President of the Cambridge Community Foundation, a fan, funder, and supporter of the work of the Moses family, through the nonprofits they founded and the Bob Moses Fund for Education and Organizing, which is housed at the Cambridge Community Foundation, I bring a certain perspective on Omo's story. So I have seen the Moses family in action. I had heard stories before I came to Cambridge about Bob's powerful civil rights work in our nation. And then I got to see his gentle and powerful civic leadership in our community through the Algebra Project, which Bob founded to address structural gaps in local education for children of color and low-income kids, and which continues locally and nationally. And I've seen Janet Moses, his partner at SNCC, the Student Civil Rights Movement, the Algebra Project, and his partner in life, who launched the Bob Moses Fund for Education and Organizing, as well as the Bob Moses Conference to inspire and support established movement builders and grassroots leaders fighting for equity and justice in our nation. It could never be a more important thing to be happening, particularly at this time. Omo's retelling of the story of 3 generations of his family is both riveting and powerful. To me, Omo's story is about unconditional love, the love of his parents, his family, love of community, the love of justice and respect for human dignity. It's about the power of quiet and determined leadership, of giving people space and inspiration and the resources to lift themselves up even as they help lift others. It's about commitment, about knowing that issues of equity and justice are not just an option, but they are the responsibility that each of us hold within ourselves to make this world a better place. But for Omo, it was destiny. He could have been writing autographs as a famous basketball player, but he committed himself to making a difference and wrote this beautiful book. It is deeply moving, poetic, and historical. Thank you, Omo. Please keep writing. Don't let this be your last book. We can't wait to hear you tell the story of your journey. So please join me in welcoming Omo Moses to the podium.
Well, it certainly feels like I've arrived in a moment. And so before I get started, I'm going to share 2 books. The first book is called The White Pharaoh, and my great-grandfather wrote this book in 1919. And so this is my book, which I wrote more recently. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, how these 2 books have something to do with each other. But before I get into that, I wanted to thank a couple of people. The first person I want to thank is Janet Axelrod, who's with us here in spirit. And Janet had the crazy idea that I would make a good board member of the Cambridge Public Library. And she recruited me to join the library, and I lasted maybe 2 years. So there's also the folks from Origination. I think they recruited me to join their board, and I lasted about 2 years on their board. And so, so I had an opportunity to meet Maria, Muna, and all the amazing folks at the library. And this is just one of my favorite places in the world. And I probably wrote at least half of this book upstairs on the 2nd floor, in that quiet space, overlooking Angelo's Pizza, overlooking the high school. And so I was creating stuff, but I was in the space where all those memories originated. And so that was a tremendous gift. And so there was a moment where it felt like this book wasn't going to get made in the way that I thought it was, that I wanted it to get made. And I called Gayatri, and Gayatri told me, the author gets to choose his own words. And that meant a lot. And so I got to choose my own words, I got to choose my own words. And the words come from a lot of places. The words come from my brother, they come from my mother, they come from my great-grandfather, they come from the young people we encountered in Mississippi, they come from Amzie Moore, they come from all over the place. They also come from me. And so the words began to arrive in Karen Hawthorne's creative writing class when I was in 11th grade. And some of those words made it into this book. And so I want to thank Karen for creating that space for me to find my voice and to imagine myself becoming a writer. So every time I wrote something in Karen's class, I share it with my mom. So my mom taught me how to write, she taught me how to read, and she was really my first reader, all of our first readers. And she made me feel like the best 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old wannabe author on the planet, And so as I was writing the book over the last year, I'd go to Beacon Press and share different versions of the book. And the question that always came up was, has your mom read the book yet? And I was like, no, she ain't read the book yet. And they want to know, well, how come? I said, well, if she reads it and it ain't the last version, she's going to try to edit that shit. And I couldn't let that happen. And so, unedited by Dr. Janet Moses. I know I'm forgetting folks. I'll tell a quick story. My dad won an Essence Award. We were in college. The Essence Awards were in Madison Square Garden. We got a suit. We rode up there in the limo. There was a red carpet. Me and Taba got out of the limo, and everyone's like, oh, who's that? That ain't anyone. You know what I mean? They just, we thought we're at the Essence Awards. We arrived, They weren't taking any pictures when we were on the red carpet. But then when we got in there, it was crazy. Everyone that you wanted to meet in Black America was in there, Vanessa Williams was in there. Vanessa Williams was in there. Eddie Murphy was in there, I mean, Michael Jackson was in the building, came through the building. When Denzel Washington came, every woman in that auditorium stood up and screamed, at least for a minute. I couldn't believe it, But the whole point of the story, my dad took the stage, my brother and I just sitting there, and my dad decided to thank all the women in his life and everyone except us. And I was on the stage, we were there just thank us, just say our names. But he didn't do it. And so there are people that I know I should thank. I'm not going to be able to thank y'all, but I'm thinking about you. And Vanessa Williams isn't in the building, but but there's someone else I want to thank. Last person I'm going to thank, Nina Berg, who helped us launch the Bob Moses Fund and has helped me bring this book into the world and to share it with folks. I deeply appreciate that. And so I'm going to get into it. So every time someone would ask me, Oma, what are you writing? And I'd be like, a book. And I see Donnie up there, Donnie Harden, and he'd see me, for years in the backyard just writing. And Fats would say, Donnie says, you're over there trying to write a book or something, And indeed, here it is. I was writing a book. But they would ask me, well, what are you writing about? And I'd say, a family memoir. And then they say, well, what are you writing about? And I say, a family memoir. You know, I don't know what I'm writing about. I'm just writing. And then they would ask, well, what is the title? And I'd say, The White Peril. And then they'd think and pause. And sometimes I get the question like, well, I didn't know you were writing a book about that. As if I wasn't qualified to write a book called The White Peril. And so when I spoke to Margaret Burnham, she asked me the same question. And, I said, The White Peril. And she paused and she thought, and she said, oh, the Yellow Peril. She said, your great-grandfather's book was inspired or in response to the Yellow Peril. And indeed it was. And so the Yellow Peril this is a more recent version of it, but it's an archive of anti-Asian fear that has pervaded society for hundreds, thousands of years. And so there's another book, which is an archive that Toni Morrison created, of the ways in which black folks have been characterized and caricatured in media and in other spaces. And it was Shelby, Maisha's partner. I had both of these books sitting in the living room. He was like, man, the images in the black book look like the images in the Yellow Peril, And so my great-grandfather over 100 years was trying to make a connection to the things, to the collective struggle, the things that we were all struggling up against. And so I've taken a couple images from the Yellow Peril, and my history teacher is here, some of my other teachers are here. And so I'm going to try to put my Cambridge public school education to the test and analyze this picture. You guys can tell me how I did. All right, here we go. So we got Uncle Sam, white man's burden. We got Uncle Sam, who's carrying a bunch of others up the mountain over barbarism, oppression, ignorance, towards education, past slavery, up to civilization. What do you think? Who's the other guy? That's London Jack or someone? Yeah, I don't know who his name is, but here's another image from that book. And in this one, we have the folks that have been subjugated, who have been oppressed, and now carrying Uncle Sam up the mountain. And it looks like Uncle Sam's thinking, I don't know what he's thinking, but I'm going to try to tell you what he's thinking. What's going to happen when I get to the top of the mountain? How can we build a society? Can we include the folks that help us get to the top of the mountain in that society? And so I feel like those questions are relevant today. And my great-grandfather had a lot to say about that. The Peril of Subjugation, which is the first thing I read in this book. The darker races of the world believe that it is the fixed policy of the white Christian nations of the world to subjugate them and exploit their countries and force them to accept the humiliating doctrine of racial inferiority or exterminate them. Japan, China, Africa, and the Isles of the Sea dread the coming of white Christians among them for that reason. For 2,000 years, the gospel of Jesus Christ has been propagated by white Europeans and Americans under their leadership. As to how well Christianity has worked among the white races, let the world war over the spoils of conquered countries of the darker races speak for itself. As to what the white Christian nations have done for the darker races, the destruction of the civilization in Central America, the segregated, degraded American Indian, the destruction of native races in Australia, in the Isles of the Sea, and the record of white European nations in Africa tell a sad and discouraging story of perverted Christianity. And so that was the first thing I read in this book. I was in Mississippi, and one, I couldn't believe that William H. Moses was my grandfather, and I didn't know anything about him until I got to Mississippi when I was probably in my mid-20s. But then it was remarkable for me that he had a better understanding of what I was confronting and what I was struggling with, you know, in 1990 Mississippi, 1996 Mississippi. He had a better understanding of what was going on over 100 years ago. And so I wanted to know more about who this person was. William Henry Moses was my father's grandfather, according to Who's Who Among the Colored Baptists, a book edited by Samuel William Bacote. William Henry Moses was a farmer, a rail splitter, pastor, evangelist, sensational orator, author of The Life of Christ, a man in a class by himself. He was born in Charlotte County, Virginia, December 31st, 1872, to Thomas and Sarah Moses. William was the eldest of 4 brothers and comes from a very religious stock. Mr. Moses was reared by Richard Morton, his grandfather, who was the largest and leading landowner of Charlotte County. Being the favorite of his grandfather, he was allowed liberal use of his extensive library. At the early age of 14, Mr. Moses was performing the difficult task of plowing with 2 horses. At 15, he was able to chop as much wood, maul as many rails, and cut as much grain as the average man in his prime. During the same year, he made a profession of religion and joined the Morrison Grove Baptist Church. At 17, he was made overseer of all hands on his grandfather's plantation and received for the same enough money to enable him to enter college. The book begins with his obituary, which he wrote. This was found amongst his papers after he died in 1940. It is February 22nd, 1935. The country is celebrating the birth of George Washington, and I am preparing my obituary. The doctors say I cannot live long. I am flat on my back, cannot move an inch to the right nor the left, but fighting back at death to the bitter end. Though I know he will win in the end, I have never been prepared for death. I've been too busy preparing to live the life that might be given me on earth. Were I able, and my friends were willing, I would celebrate my funeral with a happy feast. But since I have saved but a little for a funeral, I write these words to cheer those who may not have realized the fullness of life. They tell me I was born December 31st, 1872. I am uncertain about my earthly parents, but I am reasonably certain of my ultimate Creator, who is without beginning of years. The White Peril attempts to braid and bring together my great-grandfather's voice, his consciousness, with my dad's voice, his consciousness, his activism, and my own coming of age in Cambridge. Understanding the time. This is a sermon that my great-grandfather gave that was published in the Negro World in 1923 in response to Marcus Garvey's arrest. Mr. Chairman, sisters and brothers, I am one of that large group of sympathizers with this organization who has not become an active member. It is my privilege, in addition to being a pastor in the city of New York, to be the field representative of the National Baptist Convention of the United States, representing my denominational group of nearly 4 million Christians, the largest group of Negro Christians in the world. In the last 60 days, I've been in some 20 states, and everywhere throughout this country I've been north and south, east and west. During the trial of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, I have not heard a single criticism, even from those who used to criticize him and disagree with him throughout the length and breadth of this country. Whether you think it or not, don't let anybody fool you or fool themselves that the Negroes in this country or throughout the world want anybody to put Marcus Garvey in jail. Whether we are members or not, we want Marcus Garvey out. Because as long as Mr. Garvey is in, you and I are on the way in. He must come out. But I'm a preacher. I take a text, and I'm going to take it now because I preach every problem from the angle of Jesus of Nazareth. I want to call our attention in this passage that is found in the 1 Chronicles, the 12th chapter, 32nd verse. I want to remark in the first place that this passage of Scripture is a practical definition of prophecy. Prophecy is understanding a time to know what to do. And it is not something that is confined to fortune-telling. It is not the foretelling, it is the telling forth what God is doing in your day and generation. The men of Issachar back yonder in David's time understood the times. They understood that they are in a pivotal period upon which centuries and decades turned. And we are in a pivotal period upon which centuries and decades will turn. The winters of 78, 79, and 80 produced mammoth levels of snow. Emron and Tab and I weaponized it with our palms, stockpiled the freezer one last time for a snowball fight in the spring. During those years, the snow in the alley became the height of Kilimanjaro, was bulldozed, piled as tall as my bedroom window. The alley became an ivory tunnel. We became Matthew Henson, the first African explorer to land on the North Pole. We returned to school during Black History Month, where the accomplishments of other exceptional Africans were celebrated in the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary Auditorium. I am somebody, Mr. Stead said. Y'all remember that? Yes. I am somebody, we replied in unison. We were 200 pitch black to off-white 1st through 8th graders, a melting pot of voluntary and involuntary immigrants, 0 indigenous. The call and response was African, democratic in nature, an invitation for other voices to participate in a conversation rooted in work songs sung on plantations in each evolution of Black music. We grew silent as Mr. Stead announced that he had a guest speaker, a hero of the civil rights movement. I followed his gaze to the back of the auditorium, watched confused as Baba, all 5'7" of him, walked slowly down the center aisle, climbed the half-dozen steps and stood next to Mr. Stead on stage. Mr. Stead handed him the microphone. "Is that your dad?" Danny asked. I had begun to squeeze my body into the seat's crevice. "Maybe," I said. So that was my introduction to Bob Moses, the freedom fighter. The new abolitionist, how Howard Zinn described him and his comrades. They were the little fellows with the tight blue jeans who stood in the courthouses and marched in the streets and were arrested, Amzie Moore said. That's my favorite description of them. My dad would describe Amzie as his father and Ella Baker as his mother in the movement. SNCC was a group of young people moving, had the energy, capability, and didn't want any legal dragging. They didn't want that. They wanted to go into the neighborhoods. When they arrest a line today, another line would form tomorrow, as big and on, where the leadership was produced down to the last lick. Amzie said he'd never seen energy like that. We're not heroes, my dad said. We're trying very hard just to be people, and that is very hard. If anything, what we're trying to do or have to do is to see how you can move even though you're afraid. Out of Africa. So my mom and dad met in Mississippi. The long and the short of it is, they were comrades. My dad had to leave the country because he got drafted into the Vietnam War. My mother was his point of contact to his family and stuff going on in the States. At some point, they fell in love, they moved to Africa, and they had us. And one of the things that my dad would say was that, going to Africa was a choice, and that the real reason behind the choice to go to Africa was so he could do family instead of more movement. We belong to the earth. We belonged to the earth, our skins bathed in the red dirt that formed a path in front of our home in Tanzania that spread as if an ocean toward the ivory caps of Mount Kilimanjaro. We were 1, 3, and 5. Maisha, who was born in 1970, was first. Mama said she was born with her eyes wide open, that when she saw her, she knew that she and Baba had had nothing to do with what they'd created. Maisha was the only one of us who remembered her birth. She remembered a place filled with light, and they were telling me it was time to go, but I wasn't ready because I couldn't remember what I was supposed to do. It was like I felt I hadn't prepared as well as I needed to. I remembered I had done this before, and other times it had been easier, or I had been better prepared. So I didn't want to go, but they were telling me now, and that's it. That's my first memory. And then I don't remember anything for a long time. I remember the dirt, the trace of scent, contour of face, women towering beyond 6 feet on the road, knees crowning head, arms and legs carved like ebony, beads, concentric circles fanning from neck to breast, babies curled in cloth draped the long spine of back, heads crowned with calabashes of water. I remember Hamisi's cropped hair, his presence in our lives. He was a boy from the village who Baba took in, who became an older brother. I remember loitering in the shade beneath the thick branches of the tamarind tree, peeling its fruit from the ground, pulling the seeds from their shells with my teeth, sucking the pulp until my mouth puckered, the boys about Hamisi's age climbing its trunk, draped over its branches like pythons. I remember wandering alone in the distance between the tamarind tree and home. It could have been a mile, Mama said. I remember holding Baba's hand by the side of the road, waiting, watching travelers continue on their journeys, our journeys momentarily colliding. I remember Baba releasing my hand as he released chickens from coop, my thick legs attempting to keep pace with neck and beak, wings without lift, becoming quick and strong, enough to reach those flightless birds, turn them upside down. The Tanzanians called us Wa Negro. From the tribe of African Americans, Europeans were Nzungu or Mwazungu. They called each other Mweupe, light, Mweusi, dark, Omaji Yakundu, brownish reddish. There are over 100 tribes in Tanzania, many with their own language, Wachaga, Wapare, Wagogo, Wakiswahili, the most refined Kiswahili. We were torn from the road. We were torn from the road, from the red dirt that stretched to the base of Mount Kilimanjaro, transplanted onto America's glacial concrete. We would learn that our home in Same, like most of the homes of African American expats in Tanzania, had been searched by soldiers and police, that it had been reported that blacks from America had arrived by boat with guns and were headed to President Nyerere's village in the build-up to the Pan-African Conference to be held in Dar es Salaam in 1974. We would learn that in 1975, President Jimmy Carter was offering amnesty to the citizens who had refused to fight in the Vietnam War. We would learn that we'd been denied Tanzanian citizenship, that the political climate had shifted, that we couldn't become Tanzania's children. We're going to visit Bibi, Mama said. It was 1976, we were 6, 4, and 2, and Malaika getting ripe in Mama's belly when the plane left the surface of the earth, its wheels folding into its guts. We treated the plane like the road, inspected the arms of each chair as if a bush or an anthill, ran up and down the aisle, unaware that an umbilical cord had been severed, that we were being delivered to the other side of the planet. We landed in Nairobi and took off again. We landed in Paris and took off again, suspended between the earth and sun and moon for 20 hours. We landed in the South Bronx, unaware that we had reached the shores of hip-hop. We stayed there at Bibi's for 3 weeks. It was spring and wet and cold, and the red dirt buried in cement. You can fit 100 Americas in Africa, Mama said. It was our introduction to her counter-narrative, her insistence that Africa, not America, be our point of reference for life on the planet. Mama placed a book on the kitchen table that had been a gift from a professor. The book would sit like a sumo wrestler, sometimes on a milk crate in the living room, sometimes on the floor, other times on the bookshelf, always present as its photographic images took root in each of our minds. Its images belonged to America, to the birth of Jim Crow, marked the end of a journey out of Africa and the beginning of our journey into the United States of America. On the cover, a black man hung from a tree branch. Inside was page after page of scorched, mutilated black bodies among crowds of proud white faces. It was an introduction to places like Mississippi and Alabama, a recognition of the systematic lynching of black people across generations, not limited to America's South. I wondered why neck muscles couldn't prevent spines from snapping, what the men and women thought as they approached the end of a rope. What was their last thought? Were the kids alive before they were thrown into flames? I wondered where they traveled after they left their bodies, about the cosmic distance lives straddled from before being in a mother's womb to beyond breath, exhausted at the end of a rope. I wondered why white mothers had taken their babies to witness the killing of black children. So I wrote this to try and understand why my mother felt the need to show us those images when we were kids. I wrote this because the fear and anger that's alive and well in those images is now embodied in our public officials, is alive and well in our public spaces. And that same fear and anger has always been part of my American experience. I wrote this because I wanted to remember who I was before I arrived in America. And I wrote this because my parents were great parents. And they prepared us to survive and to thrive in this country. And I hope there's stuff in this book that will prepare my kids to survive and thrive in this country, that will prepare your kids and grandkids to survive and thrive and challenge what's going on in America. And so having said all that, I'm going to invite my daughter on the stage. Come on, Kamara. She's a singer, songwriter, origination dancer. I had the honor of introducing her to Diama Battle, who is, so I don't know if you can see it, but there are images of us doing, this image of us doing African drumming at the bottom is me and Taba, participating in things that Diama helped to create. So we're going to read a poem. This is our first one, and Kamara is featured in this poem. She charged me for every line. I'm not going to tell you how much. She got 3 lines, all right? So first we're going to read it, and then we're just going to play the video and see what you think. All right, here we go. And this poem, it's about me and Taba, just roaming, riding our bikes. The beautiful thing about Cambridge, once you had a bike, like the city was yours, And we spent a lot of time on our bikes just navigating and roaming. And so I wrote a poem about that. So I'm going to bump you when it's your turn. All right, here we go. The Wild. The Wild was a strip of woods on the other side of the Charles River. We were approaching the 80s, still missing teeth, when Tob and I began crossing the water alone. We rode our bikes over the walking bridge where the juvenile delinquents slept on days like this, hell-bent on shattering whatever serenity remained in the water. We rode along the opposite bank through goose-shit quilted grass. I thought of the water as perilous, not life-giving, life-taking. It had been fertile once, when the Massachusetts migrated from their winter villages to forage and hunt and fish, before the marshes were filled with dirt and paved, before the factories, before the Massachusetts were removed from the wild and remembered on the state seal, bow and arrow pointed down, signifying the authority of the state now bearing their name.
75 miles an hour,
I yelled. Engine, slivers of cardboard, we were abandoning civilization, moving beyond our parents' society's gaze. The wild was a canopy of trees, more dank and dark. We became still in its shade. I felt the urge to leave my scent on bark. Trees became audible as we filled our lungs. There was fresh blood on our shins from the bramble. Our bodies were thirsty. In the wild, we could be Africans.
100 miles an hour,
Taba yelled. We rode past the Harvard Stadium, built like an ancient Roman arena, past the Blodgett Pool, where Mama and Baba sent us for basic training. Maisha was the first to integrate, shatter the lie on the surface of the water. Coach Brunel taught us how to envision ourselves swimming like dolphins. In the imagining and reimagining, we learned to rise above the cage of expectation, circumscribing black and white life in America. Don't shit in our toilets. Don't use all our hot water, Harvard students and faculty said. Baba offered his gurus.
how does he do that?
They asked. He is meditating, we said. In the dead of winter, the surface of the Charles River became ice covered in tracks. Mama said if the ice were to break, there were currents beneath the surface strong enough to drag us to the ocean, return us to our Creator. After practice, the Blodgett parking lot became a maze of headlights, bleached blonde moms, chlorine-soaked kids huddled like penguins. Baba arrived in an Impala. It was primitive. What did you say? Baba said to the Harvard cop, detonating a decade of quiet. Maisha reached for Baba's arm, returned him to us. It was the first time we saw his anger, pent up from his perilous journey through the wilds of white America, what we felt at times in his quiet, in the tone of his voice, in a glare, the undercurrents of rage his gurus helped to contain, prevented him from drowning in, now spilling in the parking lot, flooding the Impala. I thought of the water as perilous, not life-giving, life-taking. The wild was a strip of woods on the other side of the Charles River. We were approaching the 80s, still missing teeth, when Tob and I began crossing the water alone. We rode our bikes over the walking bridge where the juvenile delinquents slept on days like this, hell-bent on shattering whatever serenity remained in the water. We rode along the opposite bank through goose-shit quilted grass. I thought of the water as perilous, not life-giving, life-taking. It had been fertile once, when the Massachusetts migrated from their winter villages to forage and hunt and fish, before the marshes were filled with dirt and paved, before the factories, before the Massachusetts were removed from the wild and remembered on the state seal, bow and arrow pointed down, signifying the authority of the state now bearing their name.
75 miles an hour,
I yelled. Engines, slivers of cardboard. We were abandoning civilization, moving beyond our parents' society's gaze. The wild was a canopy of trees, more dank and dark. We became still in its shade. I felt the urge to leave my scent on bark. Trees became audible as we filled our lungs. There was fresh blood on our shins from the bramble. Our bodies were thirsty. In the wild, we could be Africans. In the wild, we saw a colored white man who grew as tall as the tall grass with the buttercups and black-eyed Susans, as if he had abandoned civilization to become indigenous.
100 miles an hour.
Taba yelled. We rode past the Harvard Stadium, built like an ancient Roman arena, past the Blodgett Pool, where Mama and Baba sent us for basic training. Maisha was the first to integrate, shatter the lie on the surface of the water. Coach Bernal taught us how to envision ourselves swimming like dolphins. In the imagining and reimagining, we learned to rise above the cage of expectations, circumscribing black and white life in America. Don't shit in our toilets. Don't use all our hot water, Harvard students and faculty said. Baba offered his gurus.
How does he do that?
Our teammates asked. He is meditating, we said. In the dead of winter, the surface of the Charles River became ice covered in tracks. Mama said if the ice were to break, there were currents beneath the surface strong enough to drag us to the ocean, return us to our Creator. After practice, the Blodgett parking lot became a maze of headlights, bleached blonde moms, chlorine-soaked kids huddled like penguins. Baba arrived in an Impala. It was primitive. What did you say? Baba said to the cop, detonating a decade of quiet. Maisha reached for Baba's arm, returned him to us. It was the first time we saw his anger, pen up, from his perilous journey through the wilds of white America. What we felt at times in his quiet, in the tone of his voice, in a glare, the undercurrents of rage his gurus helped to contain, prevented him from drowning in, now spilling into the parking lot, flooding the Impala. I thought of the water as perilous, not life-giving, life-taking.
Another round of applause for that presentation. My name is Tony Clark, and this is actually fascinating. It's interesting when Omo approached us to kind of help the moderation. It was interesting because I've never had a conversation with Omo of really, nor Taba really, and so this is actually, you'll be seeing our first kind of iteration of a conversation, but what's been so exciting about the book is that I feel like I've been having a conversation with them and just learning a great deal, and I know that the presentation Omo provided a great deal, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions because I'm certain this is Cambridge. Everyone got a question, right? everyone has an idea. But one of the things I just wanted to, it's actually to the family, and actually, Mo, I would love for you to chime in as well. One thing I did learn, Maisha, Taba, and Omo were all swimmers at one point. And as a swim dad, you guys can help me out with anything, please, please, please. But one thing that was fascinating about in the book Omo speaks to that Dr. Moses mentioned around swimming is that in terms of you had implored your children to learn how to swim so they wouldn't be drowned by America. And you won that award, right? That you was looking to win, right? That wooden award, that wooden trophy.
So we swam in Africa. There was a pool. I think it was by the Indian Ocean. And we learned how to swim there. So when we came to America, I already knew how to swim. And my dad swam. He remembers his dad swimming in the Hudson River. the East River. And how his dad used to swim with his head out of the water, right? Because the river was polluted. And so swimming has always been and was always there for us. And so when we came to America, my mom put me in swimming lessons, and she used to take me to swimming lessons at the, first down at the pool on the river. Magazine Beach, at Magazine Beach, and then at the Y. And I got pretty good at it. And so then I guess y'all heard about the Gators, the Bernal Gators swim team. And so they took me over there to try out. And I liked the swimming, but it was really, really hard. It was the hardest thing that I had ever done. But also was lonely. I didn't quite like the culture. So I made the team, and then I quit. And then a friend of mine wanted to try out. And so I went to try out with her, but she didn't make the team. And then my mom made me stay. I wasn't intending to stay. So that's how we ended up on Bernal's Gators.
I guess it's Maisha's just really all of them, very, very talented. And Maisha, you like swimming at the Y. And I think it was the coach at the Y said, well, she's really good. Why don't you check out the Gators? And it was a different ball of wax. So she was 8 years old. And she had to swim 80 laps. 80, and she did it. Right? And the question for her and for me, if you like swimming, you really want to swim, right? You can't back down. Right? And it was a deep life's lesson, right? It's hard, but life is not easy. It's something that you like. You have an opportunity to be really good at it, right? So give it a try. I think we did for a couple of weeks. Yeah. But I said, you just can't back down. That's not how I was raised. So anyway, that was it. And it was amazing. And when I decided to go to medical school, it was a crazy idea at 40 years old. I was an anthropology major, and so I had to take all of my pre-med courses. And so I took them at Northeastern, and I had one course in anatomy, and we had cats. We were doing dissections, right? And so I would take Maisha to the workout, and she would swim her 80 whatever laps. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but that's what she was able to do. But I said to myself, if she can do that, then I can sit in the stands with this dead cat and work. Because I would have to take her back home and then go to class over at Northeastern. So I said, if she can do that, then I can sit in these stands and do it. So I've always said, she got me through medical school.
Hello? It is. My experience with swimming was different. I tried to quit when I was 4. So hearing Maisha quit, that's funny to me. Maisha used to want me to walk with her. I'd tell my father I was sick, had a stomach ache. We were swimming for 4 hours at 5, 6 years old. So I think he looked at it as we were basically integrating Bernal's Gators, right? Only black kids that were there. And I think the thing that it taught us was that we could still be ourselves. So it wasn't like we have to go to the swim pool and act like all the white kids that were swimming on the swim team. We just brought ourselves to the table, and we've been doing that our whole lives. So that was the position they put us in.
Yeah, swimming was remarkable. I know everyone's here like, why the heck are they up here talking about swimming? But we first swam on the Cambridge YMCA Sea Crovers. I loved it because the water was warm. My dad took us over to the Blodgett Pool to try out. That water was cold. I didn't make the team the first time. He forced me to go practice with him at that pool that whole summer and then try out again, and I made the team. And I'm forever grateful for it. I feel like the majority of things that I've accomplished in my life have something to do with what I learned and experienced in that pool. And to me, you know, Coach Burnell had high expectations, and every swimmer in that swimming pool was getting trained to be an Olympian. He didn't care who it was, you know? And so it forced me to push beyond my own physical limits, beyond my mental limits, to really tap into my spirit to be able to accomplish and achieve something. And so when you think about that within the context of society, within the context of school, where kids, people might have low expectations of kids, you might have a narrative that says you're supposed to be like this, you're supposed to do this, you can't do that. Well, once we were champion swimmers, so we were the fastest swimmers in our age group in New England. You know, there was a Swimming World magazine which had the top times of swimmers across the world. And we would look at those times, and at one point I said, well, I want to swim as fast as anyone on the planet. And that meant that I had to go to that swimming pool and apply myself for 3 hours as much as I could. And then I got in that water at the end of the year, and I swam as fast as any human being my age on the planet. And so those are life lessons. And so I'm looking for a pool to put my son in so he can learn that lesson, you know? Because, I mean, people know me for playing basketball. I was a better swimmer than I was a basketball player at 8, 9, and 10. And the reason I became a good basketball player, and Donnie will tell you, and Moke will tell you, because I took that lesson in the pool, and I stayed on that court, and I practiced, and I practiced, and I practiced myself into becoming a pretty good basketball player.
I'll speak from a little different perspective. So I'm a project kid when I met the Moseses, and we just were at awe that they got up at 5 in the morning and jumped in the pool. We all learned how to swim at the old pool on Harvard Street, which was a Newtown Court pool, which was a temporary MDC pool that was only up from June, the Izzy's Park now was only up from June till August, and then it was gone. Rest in peace, Howie Jones was the lifeguard, and I once asked him, well, you didn't know how to swim. And he said, the pool was only 5 feet, Moke. I could stand up in it. Just thinking about how he switched over to the basketball experience. Omo does not get enough credit for this, that he was, without a doubt, and we have these debates, you know, everybody was great, but Omo was the hardest working individual I ever seen in a sport. Omo was committed in a different way, probably, now I understand from the pool experience, but his accolades in basketball well, he was talented, but they really came from hard work. I remember a time when, we used to play basketball every day. How we met was back in the day in Newtown Court, they had a gym, and me and him, he was younger with my brother, we would battle every day, like literally every day. We're playing 2-3 hours of basketball, going at it, doing what kids do, and always with a competitive edge. But Omo took it to a whole nother level. I can remember a time when it was snowing out, and he's like, what are we doing today? Everybody's like, we're chilling. And if Janet will know this, they didn't have a TV, so oftentimes they would come to my house, these two, to watch the basketball game, you know, the playoffs in the NBA. They would sneak over. We just lived across the street to watch the basketball games. But one day, almost like, let's go shoot some jump shots. I'm like, bro, it's snowing out. I'll meet you at St. Mary's, he said. Needless to say, he was the only guy at St. Mary's shooting jump shots because Moke and all the other basketball players were not going to put in the time that Omo put in. And so I think when he tells his story about the pool and how early on he learned how to really, you know, take that competitive edge and translate it into life, it's just so truthful. I remember even when we played on the high school team, right? We'd have practice. Omo would be jogging around the river, and then he'd come and practice. And I always tell this story, and he'll laugh about this. The coach used to love Omo, not because he wasn't good in basketball, just because Omo was the consummate player, teammate, leader. But we were in the weight room one day, and every time Omo would do dips, he'd buy us pizza. So I'm like, oh, we're hungry. He'd go do 30 dips, and then we'd go buy pizza and all walk home to the port. I just want to say how much I love the fact that Omo was taking a lifelong dream and turning it into what we see here. I remember talking to him when he didn't finish college. He speaks about this in the book, and we all were off doing our thing, but I always knew that he was going to come back full circle, and I'm just happy to be on the ride.
Can you guys hear me? Yes. I know there's a lot of, when I think about the Moseses, I think about school, and so it's kind of serendipitous you moved on School Street from Peabody Terrace. And so I'm actually going to ask a question to Moke, and would love for Taba to chime in and everyone else to chime in. One thing what I found fascinating about the stories that you told about your brother was that I thought about the fact that in terms of our schools are so fixated on compliance, they're not really allowed for creativity. And I thought, and so when you spoke of, now I'm not going to drive it, either one of you guys drive pretty fast according to the book, but there was this level of creativity that I think our schools stymied us. So in terms of, obviously, Moke, you're a policy maker, but in terms of, I thought that there was such a creativeness in the working, which you would do in Taba with the young folks in Mississippi, in which I think particularly, I don't know how many folks are familiar with City Year, and I'm not here to publicize City Year, but there's this dynamic that City Year talks about having a near-peer experience, in how they put folks in the school so they have a near-peer experience, and I thought that the work in which Taba was doing in Mississippi was so instrumental in how do we think about that work, no pressure, Mo, and how do we look at kids differently, holistically, and not be so fixated on one-size-fits-all model. And then maybe, Taba, you could talk a little bit about your experiences of working with the Dusties and I think Cookie out there in Mississippi.
Yeah, so great question. I think that there were a couple of things that grounded us as kids. So as Omo talks about in the book, it was a group of brothers who hung out every day. There were a couple of groups that may not have made the book, but there were brothers. We were all siblings, usually 1 or 2 years apart. We hung out every single day, always doing good things in the port, right? So in our maturation, I think there were just a few things, Tony, that really grounded us. My father, so of our peer group, only me, Omo, I think it was just us, who actually had fathers in the home full time. So that was one thing that just was a common thing, and we all, you know, there were other people, Biz and Sion, like there were other people who had their father, but for the most part, it was just us. And we were also grounded in this notion of sort of school first and education first. I think that, and it's funny because my dad, whose birthday is Thursday, and Omo's father have the same birthday. We found that out like a lot later. But as we became our little village supporting each other, I think what really happened was there was this certain level of understanding of what the school system could give you and what it couldn't, and making sure that, you know, we did that within our own village. I remember having a conversation, and whenever we went to Janet's house, she would, I don't care what happened, you'd have a bunch of kids running around, and if you had too many ain'ts coming out your mouth or you mispronounced things, Janet was on you. She would say, that's not how you say that, you say it this way, now say it again. And so we had this village that reinforced the importance of education, and it wasn't really, while we depended, I believe, on the schools as they were, there was also this other level of how we took care of each other and how we supported each other. And I think that as we all matured and went in different places, I think that kind of kept us grounded. I remember when Taba had gone to Tufts, I think we were at Pitt or GW, but I just remember how a lot of the lessons that we learned on School Street kind of helped us to create our own individual lanes. And as I'm a business partner with Taba now, when we're in meetings and he always says stuff like, You know, I never had a job. Like, I never worked for anybody, right? And it's this entrepreneurial thing that was put into him through the family stuff with YPP and the Young People's Project, but it's just also really understanding what giving back looks like. And I'm thankful to the Moseses for bringing the Mississippi experience to us in Cambridge. I remember when those kids all first came to School Street, right? And this was a culture shock for us, and I think Bob or Omo had you know, Cornell West, and we received them. And it was just a real culture shock to see what poor kids from Mississippi and how they were going to survive a summer and build a lifelong relationship with us in Cambridge. I laugh at one story because the kid said, I said, what's your name? And he said, I'm Bosun. And I said, well, how'd you get that name? He said, because my daddy named Bo, and I'm his son. I'm Bosun. And it was that type, and that was a true story, and it was that type of culture that they brought to Cambridge through Mississippi. And that's when I understood some of the stuff that I know now later, and Bob and Janet's experience down in Mississippi in the movement, and as their children have sort of continued that through YPP and the Young People's Project and the Algebra Project. So, Tony, just to your question, I think we really have to just make sure that there's other support available. The schools will do some things for children, but the truth is that you need your village to really support you and your aspirations as you mature through this world.
Yeah. I'm going to say one thing, and then Tom, and then, okay. I just wanted to say, you know, I'll never forget when Moki pulled me aside and showed me a letter that his father wrote to him. And when I was writing the book, one thing writing the book, it felt like I was just piecing together all these kind of poignant moments. But I remember that letter, and it talked about his aspirations for you, that you had the ability to go to Ivy League colleges, and he just saw your potential. And so I think, you know, we had that growing up, where we had parents who had dreams for their kids, who were sharing those dreams with us, and really pushing us and challenging us to pursue those dreams.
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly. I think I was 19 or going on 20 when I went to Mississippi. So I needed a little break from being down the port. At that point, my father was going back and forth. Every week he had a schedule. He'd go to Brooklyn for 2 days, then he would jump on a plane, then he would get in a rental, and then he would like drive to the Delta, which was like 3 hours, right? To go work in a classroom in the middle of nowhere, come back, see my mother for a day, wake up the next day, and he's gone. At that point, my mother was like, she was a little frustrated. I used to go to the liquor store, get her wine, make sure she was straight. This is a true story, right? So then my father would be like, yo, you know I gotta go, just take care of your mother. I'd be like, all right, I'm gonna get her some more wine. So I go to the liquor store, have someone buy me some wine, bring it back home to my mother. This went on for about a year. It went on for longer than a year, but this is just this part of it, right? This is a year of this part, right? So I'm not gonna keep talking about my mother, but he's like, Tapa, take care of your mother. I'm like, all right, no problem, I got you. Because I was the only one home at that point. And I would be out running around doing what I was doing, but I would always check on my mother. Then I got to the point where I was kind of worried about my pops. He's doing all this driving by himself. And one day he asked me about the kids out there. He was like, I can't reach them. And I was like, what you mean? He's like, I can't get to them. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? He's like, I'm trying to teach them math. I was like, you got to get on their level. You got to be who they are in the classroom. And he was like, I want to talk to you about that. So we kicked it for a while, and then he asked me to go. I really went to like make sure he was straight, did a lot of driving with him. And I was like, what the hell am I doing in the classroom? I'm not a teacher. He was like, I just want you to come meet the kids. So I met all these kids from Mississippi, and they were just like us. They were just country. You couldn't really understand them. But they grew up kind of how we grew up, you know? And I went to every hood in Mississippi, ended up in every project, and I just dealt with the kids for who they were, and they couldn't believe that there was someone like me in their classroom. And I just tell them, look, I'm not too far off from being who you want to become, you know? And that was real to them. So they could see themselves in me, and they kind of, like, they could see a path, right? I go to the gym with them, I break up fights. Anyone want to fight, we go get the boxing gloves, go outside. Kiki needed something, I take Kiki to his mother's house in the project. She'd be like, can Kiki go with you for the weekend? So I kind of opened up my arms, but I did the same thing I did with them that we did in our neighborhood, raising the kids that came up under us out here. So it wasn't a big thing, but when you transfer that into education, it becomes meaningful. And when kids have a voice at a young age and someone that they can relate to at that age, where they say, you know what, I can be like that person, it becomes powerful. And I think that's what we really brought to the table in terms of like being out in Mississippi at that time.
I'm going to speak just a little bit about why Bob decided to go back to Mississippi and why algebra. And really what he wanted to do was to use what SNCC had done and local people, what had happened in the 60s in Mississippi, and import that into the classroom, right? And out of that, he hoped that he would, or the students, not he, but the students would be able, and their parents and the community would be able to kickstart a movement around their right to an education. He said there were plenty of people who advocated for Black people to vote. That was what people, particularly in the North, did. He said, but nothing changed until the people in Mississippi went down to the courthouse, right? So you can advocate all you want, but until people feel their power, understand their power, and act on their power, then nothing moves. And so the same thing is about the classroom. And I just want to differ a little bit. It's all right, you know, there are exceptions to the rule. You know, so Bob is a MacArthur, right? Bob is a graduate of Stuyvesant High School when there were maybe 2 or 3 people in Stuyvesant. I think it was 2, he and Al Passant were the only 2 people in their graduating class. And when he graduated, there were 8 Black people who graduated from Stuyvesant High School. And if you look at the record from, I think, maybe last year, the year before, there were 8 Black students accepted into the freshman class at Stuyvesant High School. They accepted 11, 8 went. So we hone in on what we think are exceptions. And we don't want to face the fact that America has never been interested in the education of its formerly enslaved people. Never. And it is still not interested in the education of its formerly enslaved and poor people, right? And so you are looking at systemic institutional problems, and we like to point to certain people as exceptions. So why can't everybody be Obama? Right? You're out of your mind, right? And it helps us avoid the institutional impediments, right, that keep certain people on the bottom. Black people, students, not everyone, but as a whole have always been at the bottom of the achievement level in Cambridge. Now, you're going to say all Black kids are stupid? No. The reality is, the metaphor that we use, the achievement gap, right? 70% of white kids in this country cannot, 4th graders cannot read, nor can they compute, right? Black kids are worse off. So the question is, if the problem is the achievement gap, do you want to drown at 10 feet of water, or do you want to drown at 25 feet of water? They're all drowning. And we're at the bottom because of the history of this country. So we have to keep that in mind, because unless we are willing to face the institutional culpability in all of this, we're always looking at exceptions or we're making excuses, or excuses so that we don't have to face the fact that we as citizens can do something about it.
I want to thank you for that. I wanted to follow up. One of the, with Maisha and Omo, if you want to chime in as well. One thing, obviously, the work of W.H. Moses is phenomenal. That's a whole conversation in itself. But there's something about both in your dad's book and your book, you reference the interviews with young people. And I just found that to be so fascinating. I know Brother Reeves has done some interviews in the past, but I think that there's something, when you read the book, be very keen to the interviews that are had, because those kids are our children, both in our past and our present. But I'm just curious, in your work, both of you guys' work, how have those interviews kind of informed you or informing you?
So I want to answer that question, but maybe in this way, I want to pick up on what Taba was saying about his story, because by the time Taba went down to Mississippi, I was out in Oakland, and I had been living in Oakland for a number of years, and I had been working with the Algebra Project for a number of years. And I had been all around the country with the Algebra Project, doing the amazing work that the Algebra Project does in rural classrooms, urban classrooms, and was very fulfilled by that work, but also starting to get burnt out by the challenges of it, trying to help schools change by organizing with teachers, with schools, with communities. And the energy of the kids was always there, right? And your interviews, your reference to those interviews speaks to that. But more often than not, the kids were reacting to the dysfunction that they were experiencing in dysfunctional ways. And I experienced that acutely when I was in Oakland, when I first left Cambridge. And so in all that time, in all those years, all over the country, when I got to Mississippi, and my dad had been inviting me down to Mississippi for like 3 years, he kept trying to get me to come and work and live in Mississippi. And I didn't really want to do that because I was very happy in Oakland. But when I got to Mississippi and saw what the kids were doing, and as a result of what Taba just described, right, his work, going out into the community and making relationships and just connecting with the kids. The energy that was there in those kids was just like the energy that Amzie Moore described about the SNCC workers. Like, it was that same energy. It was powerful. And I had been all over the country, and nowhere were there children in the country who were organized with each other, loving each other, around the consciousness that they had something to do, something constructive and positive to do, to change the quality of their own lives, to help each other, to challenge the system, and to do all of that around this idea of doing beautiful math. That's what they inherited from the Algebra Project. Nowhere And so when you read those interviews, they're wonderful conversations, and they feel like ordinary conversations, but what they represent is the unleashing of youth power. And these children are everywhere, in every community. They're here in Cambridge. Cambridge education has the same problems that it has today. It has the same problems that it had when we were going through school. And there's no way, and this was Taba's lesson, and this was Amzi's lesson about the SNCC workers and the movement. There's no way to move the schools without moving the children. And there's no way to move them without creating the space to allow them to move themselves and each other.
I just have two more questions. See, Larry's here. I'm not going to be as verbose as Larry. I'll get done. But there's so much richness in the text from, New York, Mississippi, and I'll just be brief. But Momo, it made me think about this as Taba was speaking. You said you was able to get stories while drinking wine with your mom. At bars with Taba, but also at the pond with your dad.
Taba's a great storyteller, and I would love him just being around him, and he would talk about all his adventures and his journeys. And he was really instrumental in a lot of the aspects of the book. And it's interesting, your relationships go up and down and up and down. And so our relationship was a little bit down when I was writing the book, and I wasn't able to follow up with him and get his voice into the book as much as I wanted to. But I was able to get the young people's perspective of him coming to Mississippi and what that meant. And so when you read it, they're not talking about me coming to Mississippi, they're talking about Taba. And they're talking about what he represented, and he really paved the way for me to come in there and work with him. And so, I don't know where it came from, but I've just always been interested in people's stories, like their stories, their voice. And so a lot of the book it's a first-person perspective, And so I tried not to speak for people, but to try to figure out ways in which things that they shared with me can be woven into a story and form some kind of truth. And so my mom is easy because she loves to tell the same stories, over and over again. She's been telling them. It's the wine.
It depends on the bottle. The story changes with the different bottles.
Right. But it's so funny because it took me so long to write this book, and I'd be like, I recorded people. I'd sit in the bar with Tom, and I'd have the recorder, and I'd just record stuff, and then I'd go transcribe it. And I had to come back. I'm like, was that really true? And then I'd have the transcriptions. And so it was kind of like that with my mom, where she was telling me the story about, how she ended up in Mississippi. And crazy story, when I was first trying to get this book sold, a lot of it was I was trying to tell it through my mom's experience and through her family. And I don't know, I was just trying to do it. And so a lot of the stories were really about what it was like growing up in the South Bronx, her experiences with her dad, my grandma, kind of the role her uncle played in her life. And so I was able to stitch pieces of that into the book. But, you know, I think if you read the book, when you read the book, there's a chapter called Black Consciousness. And that's really about my mom and her journey into Mississippi and the ways in which she contributed to the movement and connected the movement to ideas of Black power. And so I felt honored to be able to share that. And then with my dad, you know, I'll never forget, like, I would ask my dad if I can interview him, and he kind of put me off. And then finally he was like, all right, I'm gonna go do it. So I had my tape recorder, and I'm like, all right, this is the only chance I'm gonna get where he's just gonna talk to me. I had all my questions ready. And so, you know, we went to Jamaica Pond. I was like, all right, let's set like the scene. It's gonna be serene. He's gonna start sharing. And my dad, he only wants to talk about what he wants to talk about. You can't get him to talk about anything that he doesn't want to talk about. And so I got a little bit from him, not much more than what you already see kind of in the books, but I got a couple nuggets. And then afterwards he was like, you should thank me for that. I was like, all right, thank you, you know. But, you know, this book was for him, you know. Yeah, it was definitely for him. And I always felt the frustration that whenever I would look in the history books, I could never hear his voice. You know, I could hear people talking about him, but I could never hear his voice. And so I was just blessed to be able to find the interviews when he was in Mississippi and talked about voter registration and just kind of that day-to-day grind in his voice and in his perspective. And so I was also able to find an interview on C-SPAN, which he gave when we came back from Africa. And so, you know, and it was him, Claiborne Carson, Howard Zinn, a bunch of other folks, and they were talking about King and thinking about King in relationship to movement. And so that was just powerful for me to hear his perspective as a 20-plus-year-old in Mississippi in the trenches, kind of working through all that stuff, not knowing where it's going to lead, and then having this C-SPAN interview when he came back from Africa. He has his kids, he has us, and he's reflecting on the movement and his role in movement, King's role in movement, and he used this metaphor of SNCC being a wave in an ocean of movement. And so a lot of the book, you know, uses that metaphor as a reference to think about who we are in relationship to this continuity of movement. And so, you know, my dad didn't just emerge. My dad came from his father. My dad came from his grandpa. My dad came from a legacy of people who put their necks on the line to try to live meaningful and dignified lives, and to try to ensure that their kids and their families could live meaningful lives, and to try to help America become America, you know? And so all that's in the book.
I'm gonna, before I close out, maybe there's a couple questions. I'd be remiss if I wanted to give Dr. Moses a moment. Janet, I just got the permission. A moment to kind of, was there one particular story in the book that stood out to you, and maybe want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, there are a lot of stories. There's stories that were new to me because you have teenage children. You don't know everything about what they're doing every minute of the day, nor should you. I learned a lot about Omo. And I don't, just off the top of my head, Tony, when you said a particular story, the acknowledgments in the book tell me an awful lot about him and his deep love for people, deep love and respect. And so that to me was really profound. And the fact that you tried to remember almost everybody and said something about them, and that the acknowledgments were from your heart. And so there are parts in the book that I felt like crying. There are lots of things in the book that made me laugh. But the acknowledgments, the breadth and the depth of those acknowledgments, his gratitude. So that was a profound gift. Really profound.
I just want to say thank you to Omo for this particular work. I think in the work, and it's not hyperbole, I think you hear parts of Du Bois, Souls of Black Folks. I think you hear Claude McKay. I think you hear The Fire Next Time. I think you hear a bevy of particular voices, and particularly you say things that a lot of folks are unafraid of, particularly when you talk about the humanity of the black body. So this is a book that we all should read. One thing that my mom had taught me years ago was like, try to read a memoir every month to learn about someone, a memoir, autobiography, or biography. And I think obviously the month is young, but it's just an opportunity. I'm not to just kind of look into the world, and your familial stories, they're just so fascinating, particularly W.H. Moses. I mean, obviously your family and South Carolina, and the fact that you and Taba had the foresight to pick up your granddad and bring him back. Like, it's such an ingenious opportunity to kind of look into something really humane. And I just want to say one last thing. There was something in growing up in the port. I didn't see it often, and I just thought about this as Janet was talking. I delivered newspapers, but one thing I would see in the morning periodically was you and Bob holding hands and walking the street in the morning. And I don't know about a lot of folks who are here today, but there's something very revolutionary about black love. And I just want to... I want to thank you for that. You want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I don't know if I'll get a chance to say this. So there's so many things about the book, Omo, that I appreciate. And I have to confess that I haven't finished it yet. And Omo made that okay, because when I first started reading it, like, I just cried all night. Because there's so much. And I'm still processing all of that. So I've read a little bit more. But one thing that struck me, the choice to name our dad Baba, I thought about that really deeply, because I remember when we came from Africa, it was really easy to start to call you Mom. It was a really easy jump from Mama to Mom, and it felt natural. And I had to decide, and it took weeks, maybe months, I don't know. I had to decide to switch from Baba to Dad. And that was a really hard choice, because I could feel in my bones what I was losing in that choice. And so I just want to thank you for bringing Baba back.
I would just say two things in closing. That one, I'm grateful that one of the things that, and Janet speaks about this, Omo as well, I think one of the lessons, the big lesson learned, is to really have any movement and to make real change happen, you have to invest in the power of organizing in a real way. Sometimes people hear the word organizing and they think of it as this kind of like noble notion, but the truth is that much of the success in the movement that Bob and Janet had, and even Omo and Maisha and Taba in building the Young People's Project, Convergence Project, it's all about how you organize, in this case, young people, and then move to action. And I think that that's an important lesson to learn. I think sometimes people underestimate the power of organizing in a real, true way, where you not only gather people together, but you get them to buy in and then get them to believe in the thing that they're organizing around, right? And to make sure that they're really invested in that thing. And I think Omo, Tarbara as well, Maisha, they spend a lot of time really with young people, really going beyond the transactional relationship, right? You don't just have to show up at YPP, you have to be part of YPP, right? And I think that that's a thing that's really underestimated when you deal with young people. You have to invest in them, you have to believe in them, you have to encourage them, and you have to prepare them. I, for one, am a big skeptic of just throwing young people out there and saying, oh, they're young, isn't it cute that he's speaking at the mic? I'd rather set that young person up and prepare them to be able to speak at the mic, to be confident in what they're speaking about, to have the agency to really force change, starting with the organization of young people for a cause. And I think that that's a lesson that I learned from the Moseses overall. And just thinking about Omo and how similar to Maisha, when you read the book, because I'm in the book, it's just thinking about how he could remember all of these authentic conversations and things that happened when we were young. When he signed my book, his first thing was, thank you for the brotherhood. And if anybody knows me, because we had the same friend group, I've tried a lot to keep my group together. When other people have lost their kind of group, I do my best at all times. And I gotta tell you, it's a lot easier at 12 and 13 than at 50. But I've tried for my entire life to keep us together with purpose and intentionality. And it hasn't quite worked all the way, but I think we've done pretty good, besides those of us who have gone on to heaven. But I'm grateful for the fact that our brotherhood has lasted through the test of time. Right? And they always say that if you have a friend, the time doesn't matter. It's the space in which you're in with them that really matters. And we've been able to keep our unit together. So I'm thankful that he's finding success and living out his passion in this. And I'm just happy to be along for the ride, as I said.
Shit. I'm not going to say too much, but I hope everybody buys the book. If you don't have it, right, go buy it and support him. That's my brother. I love you. Keep pushing.